What, are we on? Are we ready? Oh, I thought you'd give me the signal. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to another edition of Black Focus. I'm your host, Ron Edwards, coming to you from the corporate studios of MTN, the Minneapolis Television Network. And man, the weather is something everybody's talking about. Of course, there is a lot on the platter, if you will, both internationally, domestically, locally, if you will, and et cetera. But let me do this at the very top of this afternoon's program. We will be having we hope all of our programs are interesting, but we will be having a most interesting program next Tuesday. We will have the mother of a young African-American individual who was intentionally murdered by being given an intentional dose, if you will, overdose, and etc. In a very high-profile case that actually started about 12 years ago when an attempt was made to assassinate his sister, who had been a witness to an offense. She was not a part of it. She was merely driving down the street, thought that she was doing the right thing by giving the police information as the gunmen shot back and forth over her car at each other. Unfortunately, she and the family, the sister/daughter, found out that was a grave error, and they became the subject of a vendetta, if you will, by organized crime operatives as well as the police. And so we would ask you to join us next week as this mother who lost her son in November there on Knox Avenue in Plymouth, if you will share with us the pressures and the threats and all of that goes with a mother who is attempting to do the right thing by her children and having them do the right thing. It's a story we feel is important, if you will, particularly in light of the fact that in the last month, the mother has written 3 letters, each to the mayor of the city of Minneapolis and to the chief of the department, no response, if you will, in regards to all of those particulars that involved first the attempted murder of her daughter, or giving a statement to the police, the shooting of her son by a gunman in broad daylight on Laurie Avenue in 2015, and then ultimately his assassination in North Minneapolis on Knox Avenue in November of last year. We just feel that as a part of the due diligence of MTN and its staff and its leadership, particularly its general manager, that we were able to encourage the mother to sit with us next Tuesday in these studios and talk about the dangers, think about this, the dangers of trying to do the right thing under color of law. And so we hope that you're able to join us. Ooh, excuse me, bless me. A lot going on. Our president, Donald Trump, is in Vietnam as we speak, meeting and getting ready to meet with the Rocket Man, if you will. Ooh, we've got some dust in the air. Well, it could be snowflakes and it could be below zero in here, but it's not. It's excellent. And we apologize for the sneezing, but nothing we can do about it, if you will. President in Vietnam, Rocket Man, arrived by train. The leader of North Korea made a 50-hour trip on a bulletproof train, if you will, from North Korea through China and into the northern part of Vietnam, into Hanoi, if you will. This is going to be an interesting summit. We will watch it closely. Certainly we will be reporting on it from here at MTN. No, we weren't getting ready to tell no stories as if the general manager, Val, was getting ready to fly a contingent of us to Hanoi on a big 747. Now, It ain't going to happen like that. But we certainly will be keeping it on our dial, if you will, as a part of the continuing broad expansion that is taking place with regards to the gathering of news, information, and et cetera under the current leadership of MTN. And we just are elated, really, that we are part of this renewed mission, if you will, that is looking at what is happening. Because MTN and, talk television, talk radio, and all of that, that's what it's about, providing information and being able to show an understanding of the broad spectrum of information, news, knowledge, and et cetera, and not get so locked in that the only thing we're thinking about is somebody in a massage parlor, if you will. Bob Kraft, the owner, if you will, of the New England Patriots, the man who has been in the forefront of criticizing African American football players in the NFL, got caught in a bad situation down in a place called Jupiter, Florida. And do you know that it happened 2 days before the Super Bowl? So he was sitting up there in his executive box, and he was probably worrying about if the information was going to be exposed that he had retained the services on 2 consecutive days, apparently the 19th and 20th of January, of a paid prostitute, a young Asian woman who had been brought into this country illegally, and slave and sex slave trafficking and et cetera. But that'll be something we'll certainly be looking at over the next number of weeks, if you will. Mr. Kraft does not have his next court appearance until early April. It'll be interesting to see what the NFL does with regards to its policy of accountability and et cetera. It'll be interesting to see if Mr. Kraft owner, if you will, of the New England Patriots and a longtime supporter and believer in Donald Trump and having African American football players toe the line, kind of dance, buck and wing, if you know what I mean, finds himself in a bad situation. Of course, we have some others, if you will. We all know about the story out of Chicago with regards to the young man, a former star on the sitcom Empire, has ruined his career. And R. Kelly was released yesterday on $1 million bail, if you will. That's going to be interesting. And so there's just a lot of stuff going on in America. Big money taking the position that they can do like Big Daddy, that's Donald Trump, who is not accountable to anybody, do anything he wants, if you will. Now everybody's nervous because word has come down that Special Counsel Mueller is about ready to hand over, this is interesting too, hand over his investigative report, which is, 18 months, if you will, to the now Attorney General of the United States, Mr. Barr. And Mr. Barr has indicated that there are some rules and regulations about being able to access the report, if you will. That was something that obviously the Fourth Estate, American media, so busy chit-chatting, talking, being on sets and et cetera, didn't pay any attention to what the rules say. See, that's all of a sudden now everybody wants to play by the rules. And the rules basically say that there is information that does not have to be given to the general public, which kind of makes you wonder, well, why do we have all of our prime TV time blocked and, infringed upon as we didn't, but as people held their breath waiting for this investigative report. Remember, it started out the Russia examination, if you will. By the way, about 2 hours ago, as we were traveling in here to studio, story broke that on Election Day, midterm 2018, lo and behold, the Russians almost penetrated our quote-unquote cyber network and were in a position if not blocked, allegedly by the United States Armed Forces Special Tactical Units, was going to be able to play with the American election again, if you will. It came out just like we said about 2 hours ago. Again, we are taping on Tuesday from the corporate headquarters of MTN, and so that will be something for a lot of discussion, if you will. As we said, there's a lot on the platter. If you will, people are, nervous about, really people are nervous about the future of the country. You kind of hope for the best, if you will, but only history, time, and God will know, if you will, how this is going to work out. We also want to take a look at some of the local actions that are going on. That's what MTN is primed for, if you will, and that's what the leadership here has done a beautiful job of making sure that information and et cetera gets out. We've had a number of conversations. We're moving around. This is a part of how we want to operate with all of this news that is out there. There is a lot of discussion going on with a couple of important court cases that will start in April, in fact. MTN actually broke the stories on two of these law enforcement police cases, if you will, out of these studios. One was Terrence Franklin, a young African-American, brutally killed in a basement in a house almost 6 years ago now. It took 5 years to get through the courts, the appellate courts, and the United States Supreme Court, which sent it back and told the city of Minneapolis a number of months ago. Actually, it was in December of 2017. We first started reporting it in February of 2018. It's been a year now that the city of Minneapolis would have to stand in quote unquote in the circle, if you will, and defend its actions in the death of Terrence Franklin, a young African American shot to death in a basement at inside of a private home after being chased into the basement, beaten and et cetera. Most of his head blown away by officers who couldn't quite get the story right about what really happened in that basement. We will, during the month of March, for absolute transparency, we will be talking about aspects of the case as we did a couple years ago from documents that we obtained from the attorneys for Terrence Franklin and from the archives, if you will, of the United States Supreme Court. It is a chilling case, the case of Terrence Franklin. It should frighten anybody, but definitely should frighten African Americans. We should be real frightened with regards to what kind of rights we have, particularly in light of a story, and then we'll come back to the other case, particularly in light of the story on a couple of Minneapolis stations last night, which caught some people off guard. Didn't catch us. We had heard about it. We wondered why leadership in St. Paul, as an example, black leadership, had not talked about it, and that was the beating of a young African American in the Ramsey County Jail who was not under the current sheriff of Ramsey County, Sheriff Fletcher, who has returned to that office after being defeated a couple of years ago, well, almost a decade ago, but Fletcher has returned. It showed a brutal beating by county deputies and corrections officers inside of the Ramsey County Jail of a man who was, he was handcuffed. He had the shield over his face and his mouth and et cetera. He had been maced. He was beaten. Channel 11, Channel 9 were responsible last night for breaking the story per se, if you will. The young man in question, living in such fear that he relocated from the Twin Cities to Spooner, Wisconsin, if you will. Kind of tells you something about it. There are far too many of these cases and these videos and et cetera showing misconduct by authorities. And clearly a decision is going to have to be made to deal with it. We would assume that the new incoming Attorney General for the state of Minnesota, former Congressman Keith Ellison, will take the forefront, if you will. We've not necessarily heard that. We've not necessarily seen indicators that that's what will happen. But you'd be surprised, my friends. And as we said, next Tuesday, we will be live, and we will talk in terms of a series of incidents that took place that devastated the family and ultimately led to the death of a young man in a home there on Knox Avenue and Plymouth Avenue North, if you will. So there is a lot out there. You know, there's enough places at the table that we all can come together and find out what is really happening, why the temperament, if you will, of different communities, different bases, as we like to refer to them now, bases, i.e. groups, are feeling such a level of mistrust, hostility, and et cetera. But of course, on the other hand, we must make accountable the leadership of our respective communities to be in the forefront. I must say, in many regards, such as the case of the young man beaten in the Ramsey County Jail 3 years ago, that I question how effective that leadership has been or is going to be or has any interest in being, if you will. But they are, quote unquote, the guardians. Some are well compensated, well paid, if you will. A lot of money has been spent in the last couple of years with programs dealing with trauma, if you will, and police reform and et cetera. By the way, on that particular question, moving quickly back and forth, article in this Sunday's edition, Minneapolis Star-Tribune, raising questions about the effectiveness of Mayor Melvin Carter in the area of police reform. Interesting story, long story also, over 2,000 words, if you will. Raises interesting questions about campaign promises that some feel are not being kept. Former president of the NAACP of St. Paul, critical of the mayor, if you will. At one time they were allies, or at least people thought, indicating that in the last year or so, since Mayor Carter has been mayor, that there has been difficulty by the civil rights groups in St. Paul to meet with the mayor to talk about some of the problem areas and et cetera. This is not something we're making up here at MTN. This was in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune's Sunday edition, if you will, front page of the Metro section. I think it caught some people off guard, particularly coming on the heels of some questionable mismanagement in St. Paul within the police department, where St. Paul is one of the few, very few, mid-sized or major cities in the United States of America that has no African American females on their police department. The information finally slipped out a couple months ago, about a month and a half ago, that the last African American female police officer had retired in, well, it was September of 2018. No one apparently paid any attention until some way or another it came up. Some African American male officers in St. Paul are saying to their colleagues over here in Minneapolis that leadership in St. Paul knew that the last, kind of like the last officer standing, female, black female, was retiring, moving on, if you will. No preparation was made. Article, Minneapolis Star-Tribune, we touched on it briefly here at MTN, is an article which talked in terms that right now they're looking at best 2 to 2.5 years before they will have a quote-unquote African-American female on the path to becoming a St. Paul police officer. And we're not doing that great here in Minneapolis. We talked about that here at MTN. We only have 6 African-American females in the Minneapolis Police Department. I only have had 1 new one in the last 4 or 5 years, so that means that if folks don't start getting on top of recruitment and such things as that in a couple of years Minneapolis can find itself going in the same direction. Now that comes on the heels of a meeting last Thursday. Again, we're taping and by broadcasting on a Tuesday, a meeting at the Davis Center, which is the headquarters of the Minneapolis Board of Education, if you will, and a crowd of about close to 100, meeting to discuss the future leadership only in the sense of who will be hired. Allegedly, there are 5 names, 2 African-American males, 1 white male, and 2 white females, allegedly, if you will. Interesting, the dialogue last Thursday at the Davis Center with regards to potential candidates, how they will be measured. Chief Arredondo reporting that he had interviewed every lieutenant in the Minneapolis Police Department, and that one of the things he did share with the community group that was there was that there were lieutenants that said they weren't interested in being the inspector, if you will, of the 4th Precinct, which means that there is somewhat of an albatross, political and otherwise, around the leadership as it pertains to the 4th Precinct, if you will. We certainly here at MTN will be watching closely how that pans out, if you will. The chief indicating last Thursday at the Davis Center that he's looking at basically April as the time certain, if you will. Some are concerned, though, that the assistant chief, Jose, is really not on the same page with the chief of the department. We detected that could be correct. This also comes on the heels of what was a disastrous investigation of a brutal beating, also captured on video, of a Native American 3 years ago, downtown Minneapolis, 4th and the Nicollet Mall. 1 officer finally fired, if you will. The 2nd officer, because he is a veteran, as was the correction guard / sheriff in the Ramsey County fiasco, that there is a nervousness, if you will, a caution, if you will, with regards to dismissing those who are a veteran, have served in the United States Armed Forces. And by the way, let me say this. I found it interesting, particularly KMSP Tom Lydon did a very extensive piece last night, if you will, with regards to the investigation. But one of the things that they did not do is that they did not identify openly, notice how I said that, openly, the deputy who so brutally beat the young African-American, if you will. Kneed him, hit him he hit him with some punches, man, that, if they'd have been in a boxing ring, the brother may have, went down for the count, But they did not indicate who this individual actually worked for, but what we determined, a very clever move was made by KMSP. The gentleman in question, the Ramsey County deputy, is also a wrestling coach, if you will, at one of the suburban high schools on the east side of the river. And it was interesting how they let you know, if you were watching and paying attention, what school he is the wrestling coach at, which has black students, by the way. One of the things that he said to the African American as they were brutally beating him, The African American said this is excessive force, and they, told him, you black so and so and so and so, you don't know what excessive force is, and then continued to hit him in the stomach, knee him in the stomach. Bend him over in order to make him suffocate on his own phlegm, and et cetera, if you will. Brutal beating, if you will. But the coach in question, or the the correction agent / sheriff, is a coach at Rosemont High School. They're the only high school in Minnesota that goes by the nickname Irish. And that was so clever. KMSP is to really be patted on the back for cleverness, if you will. On one hand, they wouldn't identify the white corrections officer / wrestling coach, but they made sure that you saw the insignia on the chair. It was on the chair there. You could see the coach was unhappy that he was being photographed, but I don't think he realized that they had burned him by showing the insignia, if you will, of the high school, the nickname of the high school, Rosemont, the Irish, if you will. A lot of brutality and et cetera going on. We assume that the new incoming Attorney General will certainly be on top of this. We would look for him to form a series of committees and begin to examine just what the situation is, how it's being handled, if you will. Now, this takes us back to the drug situation. A lot of people did not want to give credit, particularly in the election of November 2018, to the now departed sheriff, Richard Stanek. We had known Richard Stanek for many years, actually had a good relationship. Sometimes we would disagree on some things, but we always found him a top law enforcement officer who was responsive when we would talk to him about individuals who had come to us indicating that their loved ones needed help on how they were being treated and et cetera. And there was really not a history of mistreatment in the Hennepin County Jail under the leadership of Richard Stanek, and we hope that will continue. It also appears that there will be a stoppage, if you will, of brutality inside of the Ramsey County Jail with regards to Bob Fletcher returning as sheriff after an absence of a decade. But this is all extremely important and should be of concern, but I have a feeling that it is not in the context of the little people, the citizens, if you will, the ones that can't afford the high-priced attorneys or have a couple of buddies that are in civil rights coalitions or et cetera, if you will, who will make some noise about what happened to their fraternity brother or sorority sister or something like. You understand where we're coming from. We're just merely trying to be factual and honest, because that's the only thing that keeps us partially free as the sons and daughters of the African, if you will. Now, finishing on the court cases. Oh, we haven't forgot that. We talked about Franklin, if you will, and we will be reviewing documents from the United States filed with the United States Supreme Court over the next couple programs, if you will, here at MTN. The other case is Nord. Now let's spend a couple of minutes, because we even have here on our staff, a couple of people have talked about they are going to take some time off and want to be in the courtroom on April 1 when the trial starts and et cetera. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's great if one wants to do that. But let me give you an analysis, if you will, an analogy also. First of all, I doubt that Mohamed Nord's attorneys are going to allow him to testify. This is a very sensitive, well, all cases are sensitive under color of law, but this is a sensitive case. A Caucasian woman, a native, a citizen of Australia, shot and killed in an alley, if you will, after making a 911 call that she thought that a sexual assault was taking place in the alley behind her home in South Minneapolis. Now, we went over in great detail here on this program and sounded a warning almost 2 years ago that there was going to be a problem because of some tampering that had already taken place with the case and with evidence and etc. by law enforcement officers, but law enforcement officers who were not and are not sympathetic to Mohamed Noor as a person of color, Somali, if you will, black, if you will, nor on the greater plateau, not sympathetic or very friendly with their fellow black officers, if you will. In fact, we first reported a year and a half ago exclusively here at MTN, a Somali officer, one of the only other Somali officers at the 5th Precinct, who was really being attacked and bullied and etc. Writings left on the whiteboard, if you will, in the meeting room at the 5th Precinct and etc. The inspector, who, by the way, is being looked at as possibly coming over to the 4th Precinct. I don't think that would be a good mix for her. But these statements and references to this particular Somali officers, and we now only have, 6 Somali officers, maybe only 5, I don't know. And so we raised the question here at MTN almost 2 years ago, well, that's 2 years ago, about the conduct and what was happening. But we also raised the question about what happened that night and some of the statements made by some of the white officers who had arrived that evening, including phone calls that were made to the fiancé of the deceased young lady at his hotel suite in New York City. We talked about that here at MTN. We know that for a period of time there was an attempt to find out, how we were getting this information. We've been around a long time, and we have a pretty good feel on how to be clever, and make sure we cover our tracks, particularly when we are doing an investigative report, as we did in the case of Mohamed Noor. So in the case of Noor, his attorneys made a brilliant legal move right from the beginning when they, well, first of all, he retained their services. How that was done, I don't know if that's anybody's business, but it may come out in court, though the judge may not allow that kind of probing going in that direction. But Mohamed Noor's attorneys immediately indicated to him to remain silent, which he had a right to do. In fact, on my worldwide radio program, we had a couple callers that insisted for months that Mohamed Noor should be forced to give testimony. We had to keep explaining to people that, we're in America. If this was Russia or, Argentina, if you will, Bulgaria, Serbia, somewhere like that, the old Nazi Germany or the old Russia, that maybe you could do that, get away with it, if you will, force a person to violate whatever rights they have to remain silent, if you will, or, take a bullet to the head. I mean, this is the alternatives in places where you don't have protection under the First Amendment. And that was an excellent move, and it came to fruition, and actually, again, we were out front on this. And again, it is in the archives of MTN. When we indicated that there had been tampering with the investigation, there had been the telephone calls that night to the fiancé, informing him of who it was that had shot his beloved fiancé, if you will. But what really became disturbing was the boldness of some of the police officers, some who, by the way, were brought before the grand jury. You remember the county attorney, Mr. Freeman, brought over 50 officers before the grand jury in attempting to indict Mohamed Noor for first-degree murder. They started out at third degree and then waited a year, didn't they? They waited a year, and then without the the need to reconvene the grand jury, brought the grand jury back in and recharged Mr. Nord with second-degree murder. First time police officer, law enforcement, peace officer, etc., has ever been charged in Minnesota with murder in the second degree in a situation in which that officer was carrying out their duties and responsibilities as a peace officer, is a law enforcement officer. 50. And on these programs, for a number of programs, if you will, we shared with you, our viewing audience, and now our new radio audiences, and etc., how peculiar it was that the county attorney, Mike Freeman, who won another term in November of 2018, so Mike will be around for another 4 years, and he obviously is aggressively, very aggressively pursuing the case of Mohammed Nord in his second-degree murder indictment, and etc. And so it then raised the question about all of those officers that were brought, primarily white. I only think there was one officer of color that was brought before that grand jury. That's a lot of white officers, man. These were training officers, if you will. These were officers who had been involved in first everything from the gun range. Can you believe they brought in, individuals from the gun range to have them talk in terms of, how did Mohammed Nord fire his weapon? Did he holler and scream, out of Akbar, God is great. I mean, and I'm like, wow. And so you had those individuals, but you had this whole group of officers who also were brought in. And by the way, just so those that are listening and are chit-chatting back with their friends in the MPD, one of the officers who was involved in tampering and misconduct, if you will, which may or may not come out in the trial, it all depends on Mohammed Nord's attorneys, was demoted, not by of her rank. She is the rank of a sergeant, if you will, but she was demoted a couple weeks ago when she told a deputy chief of the Minneapolis Police Department that she and another sergeant, who are part of the so-called CERT team, the drug action team, and etc., were not going to conduct a series of raids because it was more important to let the African Americans feed on each other, if you will. Now, feed on each other is a code word for let them kill each other, as long as they don't harm anybody in the white community. They can go out there and act like a bunch of savages because that's all they are. Now, we have a situation also about, as I said, she was apparently removed and I think sent to property room or something like that. But I know it's a kind of situation that they don't like to hear us, particularly as a African American journalist and etc., have that kind of information, if you will. Basically, what you do in this society is if in a story, a major story, anything's going to be broke, it needs to be by, the right kind of people, if you will. Well, we have a long history, both here at MTN and in our other journalistic ventures and our books and TV and all of that, we don't practice the, Negro norm, if you will. The Negro norm is to take your hat off, look down at your feet, and kind of move them around like a chicken, and not look massa in the eye. Well, we don't believe in that. We think there's too much going on. There are too many red flags. There's too much danger that is going on. That MTN, as an example, is one of the few entities that is in the forefront of allowing the dissemination of information, facts, and et cetera, and that is so helpful, if you will. So, back to Mohammed Nord. Mohammed Nord will, we feel, not testify at trial, particularly if it is determined by his attorneys and by himself, Mr. Nord, Officer Nord, former Officer Nord, that, and my sense is, by the way, and we talked about this a year ago, that he will have an all-white jury, which raises the question about jury nullification. You know, we're not supposed to talk about that either. Amy Klobuchar, now running for president of the United States, was almost legendary in making sure that black folks did not get on juries and certainly didn't get on grand juries, if you will. In fact, we asked the question, we found out from sources, though, reliable sources, that on the grand jury, that Mike Freeman did not feel comfortable with trying to move to second-degree murder. There were 2 African Americans. And we first exclusively reported that here almost 2 years ago, if you will. And of course, no one challenged us. There was no questioning of the authenticity of what it was that we were reporting. Now, back to the jury, the Pettit jury, the jury that will be convened. And though there's been no motion for what is called a bench trial, where the judge would be the sole arbitrator and determinator of guilt or innocence, if you will, we assume that the attorneys for Mohamed Noor will, quote unquote, test the system as pertains to fairness against, quote unquote, the presence of bias. If you will, a lot of bias out there, man. In fact, if you really look at the records over the last 40 to 50 years here in Hennepin County, it is really tough for a black person to get on a Pettit jury, and it's almost impossible for a black person to get on a grand jury, if you will. In other words, it is not something that is open, and yet the black population has grown by a certain percentage that certainly we should be able to do a better job. Now, I'm not sure what the strategy of Mohamed Noor's attorneys will be in questioning jury nullification, the conduct of the prosecutor, if you will, if in fact they themselves will practice jury nullification, tie things up in such a way that the judge will become concerned and disgusted, because attorneys for the defense basically go in preparing up front for an appeal, if you will. In a case in which a person of color has been accused of taking the life of a Caucasian, if you will, you can just about bet that your chances are 90-10 that you will be found guilty. And so consequently, attorneys look for judicial error, if you will. Some misstep by the prosecutor, some misstep by the judge, if you will. And so it'll be interesting to see as we move into the month of March how the Fourth Estate, the white Fourth Estate, will begin to analyze the Mohamed Noor case. Now, that then brings us to the testimony. Who will be called to give testimony? Will it be anything approaching the 50 individuals who, allegedly testified before the grand jury? You don't want to wear your jury down, if you will. People, human beings, can only absorb so much. I mean, people like to, make you believe that they have a tremendous ability of absorbing and handling information, and et cetera, man, each day, by the time that trial's over, them jurors are going to be exhausted, if you will. But if their bias is in place, that it makes no difference what the defense says, in defense of the actions of Officer Noor, that because a Caucasian, a white woman, lost her life, that's the end of the doctrine of fairness and equality and balance and et cetera. I mean, that's, and I'm quite sure that these 2 white attorneys for Mohamed Noor know and understand that. Now, people basically will not face up to that until they are, quote unquote, teaching a law class at some prestigious university, if you will, or some lesser university like Hamlin or one of those, Macalester or one of those. And this is important because we have not been spoon-fed. We in the black community, be it Somali, or be it African American or whatever, we have not been spoon-fed a lot of reflections, if you've noticed, in the last 60 days with regards to, well, actually ever since maybe 90 days, the announcement by the county attorney that he had gone back in and that he had, upped the charge from murder 3 to murder 2. We were a little surprised, if you will, as observers at court, if you will, and historians, that the attorneys for Mohamed Noor had not contested that and appealed it directly to the Minnesota Supreme Court. But they have their reasons and they have their strategies, and hopefully that they're thinking and they're patient. Boy, that's so important. Patience is so important. Competency and other things are important, but patience in the defense of your client is so important. It is something that is so lacking. It's the reason that many of us loved Johnnie Cochran, that loved Thurgood Marshall, and some others. Patience, the belief that justice is a part of your right to have expectation of fairness and justice and compassion, if you will. Because of the issue of race, slavery, segregation, and etc., compassion for the circumstances and the plight of the sons and daughters of the African are not what they should be in this country, and unfortunately, I must say, will never be, because it's almost a part now of the DNA of America, if you will. And so, this is in play. Have the attorneys for Mohamed Noor shared this with their client? I doubt it. Mohamed Noor and his family and etc. are not native born to the United States of America, but that doesn't mean anything. We've got people that are native born to the United States of America, sons and daughters of the African, and they don't see the train coming sometime until it has run them over, bounced them off the tracks, if you will, detoured their lives. In some cases where you have capital punishment, cost them their lives, if you will. So in the case of Mohamed Noor, we will watch closely during the month of March here in these studios, if you will, with regards to how preparation obviously started a year ago. I mean, his attorneys, if they're worth their salt, began preparation with regards to strategy, tactics, technique, and etc., jury selection, all of that. If they didn't, which I have no reason to believe that they did not do the right thing, then Mohamed Noor just, needs to go in and tell the judge to go ahead and sentence him because he has no chance whatsoever. Now, this takes us back also to some of the information during the days immediately following the death of Justy to the Prime Minister of Australia, their quote-unquote executive leader, even though Australia is still a part of the Crown Colony of Great Britain. Their executive quote-unquote government official is the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister at that time, for those of you that don't remember, was a man by the name of Turnbull, who was actually just turned out of office as Prime Minister about 5 months ago, if I'm not mistaken. But Prime Minister Turnbull and his assistants, if you will, but really they cannot be called necessarily, and it would be interesting, and this is something that you've heard no one talk about. I wonder, sitting in this chair in the comfort of these studios, if in fact the attorneys for Mohamed Noor took depositions from Prime Minister Turnbull and any others of his staff who may have received a call, either passed that call on to the Prime Minister or conveyed to him certain whispers that were being made. You remember when Prime Minister Turnbull called Somalis savages and etc., not qualified to be law enforcement officers and etc.? You remember how people were asking? We didn't have any problem here on this set and in these studios of indicating that clearly someone was feeding information to the government, quote unquote, of Prime Minister Turnbull. We have about, how many minutes left here? Is that about 5? We have about 5 left. And so I'll begin to wrap. But I think it's so important as it pertains to the fairness for Mohammed Nord. We will also be going more into depth about the events that led to the death of Terrence Franklin in that basement in South Minneapolis it has been 6 years ago. And in the process of doing that, we will continue to remind ourselves that there are things that have not been totally completed. By the way, some people have kind of got on my case a little bit, and they said, you've not updated us on some cases. And one of them was, it was just a year ago next week that we had a man by the name of Joseph Washington in our studios, if you will. Joseph Washington was the brother of George Edward Washington, an African-American beaten to death in the Candy, Ohio County Jail, which is Wilmer, Minnesota, by sheriff's deputies. And it was an interesting case. We followed it here in studio and on this program, and as we said, the second week in March of last year, we brought Joseph Washington in to discuss what happened, the things that happened, how he was dealt with, if you will, by the BCA and others as it pertains to the death of his brother, the role of family members in being intimidated by the sheriff, if you will. I never saw so many people in my life that were in witness protection programs, if you will. So one is concerned about that. But we want to say that we never heard another word from Joseph Washington, if you will. We don't know what happened to him. We hope that he's still alive and that he's back in North Carolina. But because some people approached me and indicated that I had not been due diligent in reporting and doing an update on the death of George Edward Washington in the Candy, Ohio County Jail in Wilmer, Minnesota, that we would certainly do that, and maybe later on in March we will go into a little bit more detail, if you will, over the events that took place on the early afternoon of January 8th, 2018, when we received a call from a woman who was a friend of the Washington brothers and asked us to step in and help out and et cetera, which we did. But we are disturbed, as we're down to the last 2 minutes. I'm very much disturbed when people just kind of disappear and you kind of wonder if they're safe, if you will, that nothing has happened to them, because that sheriff up there in Candy, Ohio, in Wilmer, tough man, tough deputies up there. There have been a couple deaths up there. Well, let us never be referred to as that race or group of people that, because we do not seek information, knowledge, wisdom, and answers, that we are soon referred to as that race or group of people that have become extinct because we didn't pay any attention to what was going on in the areas surrounding, quote unquote, us. Let us make sure that that never happens. I want to be sure that I'm not quitting off too early. What do we have? We're right on schedule, down to the 4 minutes, 5 minutes, okay. A couple things on the sports thing, very quickly. We like to do that once in a while. The Final Four is going to be here in April. The college teams are going to come in. The athletic department, the white athletic directors, the white coaches, and et cetera, make a lot of money. And those poor black ball players, if they don't get drafted in a top round to pick up a couple million or et cetera, they just have to hang on as best they can and eat canned soup and et cetera, if you will. So let us never be referred to, as I said before, as that race or group of people who have disappeared from the pages of history because we didn't pay any attention to what was coming at us. Again, I'm Ron Edwards. This is Black Focus, and this is MTN.